welcome to the Rabun County Historical Society. I'm Linda Barden. I'm on the board and I have been a volunteer here for 16 years. We have just recently renovated our museum. It is totally different from what we had before. We have acquired some exciting artifacts. And so I want to show you what we have. Come on in our museum. We want our museum to be a tour through history of Rabun County, beginning with thousands of years ago when the Native Americans lived here. We have two local collectors of Native American artifacts who have loaned us the artifacts that they have found in this county. They are from the Mississippians, who were a mound building culture, and there are several mounds around this area. We have tools, we have arrowhead points, we have pottery shards. A lot of them were found out in Betty's Creek Valley on the creek, and that is the beginning. Then in 1819, the state of Georgia created Rabun County, and for years in the 1800s, it was a hardscrabble existence here, mostly frontiers people, farmers. It was hard to make a living. It was hard to get here until the advent of the Tallulah Falls Railroad. The railroad arrived in Tallulah Falls in 1882, and the railroad changed everything. Previously, a county that was nearly impossible to get to became easy. Hotels sprang up in Tallulah Falls, and it was the place to be in the summer. As the railroad moved north, tourists moved north. There was a time when there were dozens of hotels in Clayton, Georgia. Anyway, back to the railroad. The Des Oliver, who previously worked at Raven Gap McCoochie School, had an extensive collection of Tallulah Falls Railroad memorabilia. And after his passing in 2015, the school offered the artifacts to us, which gave us a wonderful opportunity to renovate our museum. So we have tools that were actually used on the Tallulah Falls Railroad. We have a couple of replica trussels that Des Oliver's students built. Another interesting piece we have is this bridge base. This timber is the actual size of timbers that would have been used in the massive trestles that were used on the railroad here. And this semaphore, which was at the Dillard Depot, served from 1906 to 1962. We have a little piece here on the founding of Rabun County, which was carved out of Cherokee territory when the Cherokees were forcibly removed from this area, and that's another story altogether. I'm sure you've all heard of the Trail of Tears. This is a drawing from 1888 of the land lots in Rabun County. Anyone who lives in Rabun County and looks at their real estate description, you will see a district and a land lot. These are all the land lots, which were given to people for the asking in the land lottery of 1819. These were a lot of the items that were actually in the Clayton Depot. Typewriter, old telephone, their telegraph equipment, scales. During the advent of while the train was here, at one time Walt Disney came here and they filmed the Great Locomotive Chase. It was a huge time for Rabun County residents. A lot of them were extras in the movie. And the story goes that at one time Walt Disney actually wanted to buy the Tallulah Falls Railroad, but didn't work out. to try to tell more about how hard it was to live here. Rabun County was known as the Moonshine capital of Georgia. People made moonshine back then because it was a way to make a living. It was a way to support their families. And they were proud of the job they did, but it was illegal. So there are a lot of great stories about the revenuers and the sheriff chasing the moonshiners. But moonshine, making liquor, was an art. We have an authentic still that's loaned to us by the Foxfire Museum and Heritage Center. We've set up, and we've got the anatomy of a still, can read exactly how one works. This still had to be rendered unusable in order for us to be able to display it. Now, another aspect of our history, which people don't really think of, you realize that 63% of Rabun County is national forest. And that came about primarily because of the industry scale logging that occurred in this county at the turn of the 20th century. These huge lumber companies came in here with no thought for the ecology. Then they clear cut this county. But in 1911, the federal government passed the Weeks Act, which enabled them to buy up this property for national forest. And they bought thousands of acres of land that the lumber companies had rendered useless. And so that's the primary reason we have such beautiful land here, is because the government owns it and it can be developed. Another aspect which changed greatly the way Rabun County lived was when Georgia Power came here and started building hydro dams on the Tallulah River. The first one was the Tallulah Falls Dam, and that was really what killed Tallulah Falls as a tourist mecca. The falls didn't exist anymore. But as Georgia Power kept building more and more dams for hydroelectric power, they created these beautiful lakes, which have been a tremendous impact on our economy. So we have a whole display here about how the dams were built, when they were built, and the beautiful lakes they created. During the Great Depression, Rabun County sent delegates to Washington, D.C. to see if we could get a Civilian Conservation Corps camp here to do some work. We, in fact, got 4. And so they did a lot of the reforestation. They built a lot of roads. They built the fire tower that's on top of Rabun Bald Mountain. And so we just have a little bit here about how much the CCC really contributed to the county in the space of just maybe 8 years, because they all left when World War II started. Then we have an entire area of our museum that's dedicated to what life was like in Rabun County in the late 19th, early 20th century, with some really interesting artifacts. We have the old Mountain City Post Office, which is pre-World War II. We have a display on the schools that were here. Schools were very different back when the county was so isolated. They had a lot of little schools because the students had to be able to walk to the school. And they didn't go very many months during the year. Children helped with families with planting and harvesting, so they only went to school when they weren't needed at home. We have an exhibit on tourism, how it was generated by the railroad. It pictures a lot of the beautiful hotels that were here. There is no doubt that there were more hotels in Rabun County in the early 20th century than there are now, by a long shot. One of the most interesting things we have in our museum, and I love to tell this story, is a copy of the Tallulah Falls Spray, which was a little newspaper that was put out in Tallulah Falls. This particular issue was dated in 1897. And there's an ad in here by W.T. York, who at that time owned the York House, which is in Rabun Gap. And the Tallulah Falls Railroad at that time had not extended beyond Tallulah Falls. He would take his wagon and go down to Tallulah Falls and pick up tourists and bring them up to the York House to spend weeks or months. Once they got there, it was great. They had dances, they had a farm, they fed them well. But the drive, he advertises in his little ad in the paper here that it was only a 5-hour drive from Tallulah Falls to Rabun Gap. Imagine that. You had to ford every stream, up and down mountains, 5 hours from Rabun Gap to Tallulah Falls. We always have a video going in the museum, a PowerPoint presentation, so people can sit and watch that. And we'd love for you to come visit us.
How long have you been a volunteer or been involved with the Historical Society?
I've been a volunteer for about 16 years.
Wow.
Yes.
Okay.
It was about the time that this building opened.
Yeah.
2007. So 15 years.
And your husband, Ron, also volunteers here?
He's the president of the board.
What's your personal connection and story with Rabun County? I always like to ask folks about that.
It goes way back in my family. My grandfather actually worked on the Linda Barden powerhouse way back when, and my dad grew up in Hollywood, Georgia.
Yeah.
So when I was a child, we visited relatives here in this area, and always came to Rabun County, which was the pretty part.
Yeah.
And I've always loved it. Showed it to my husband, who was a beach kid from North Carolina. He agreed. It's beautiful. So we set out a plan to live here. We had to wait until we were retired, but here we are.
Yeah, it sounds familiar. And
yes.
yeah. So for folks that aren't sort of familiar with the Historical Society and sort of the charter and the mission, can you just explain, some of that?
The mission, as it's written, is to preserve, protect, and show off. That's not the word we use. The Rabun County history, preserve Rabun County history. And it is a fascinating history from way back when the Native Americans lived here up through what we are now. It's that's what we've tried to lay out here. We'd love to show people there's more to this than just tourist attraction.
Right, yeah, and the legacy of things that you talked about through the tour. A lot of folks may not realize how it is that we came to have lakes, or
right.
how it is that 63% of the land population is owned by or the lands are public through the Forestry Service. So, yeah, and so how does the society accomplish that from a funding standpoint, from a staffing standpoint?
We are, the county built the building. Our basement is county archives.
Yep.
They built the building for us. And they give us a stipend every year, and they pay some of our bills. We are totally staffed by volunteers. And we have memberships. We have about 250 members. So we really need donations. We solicit, our memberships are not expensive, and our museum is free. So donations are welcome.
Yeah, okay, very welcome. Extremely welcome. And that's tax deductible?
Oh yes,
for folks?
We are a 501c3 organization, so your donations are tax deductible.
Okay, yeah, that's awesome. And so the museum itself and the center now fully back open here in early June, post-COVID?
We will reopen on June 11th. Thereafter, we will be open on Thursdays and Fridays and Saturdays from 11 a.m. till 3 p.m. It's not very many hours, but that's because of a limited number of volunteers. So we also solicit volunteers to come help us.
Yeah, I was going to say, what a great way even if you're new, or you're a longtime resident and a history buff, have a little bit of working knowledge, but you don't have to have a working knowledge of Rabun County history to volunteer.
And we also need volunteers in other areas other than being a docent in the museum. We have a website. We put articles in local publications. We put pictures and fascinating facts in the local newspaper every week. So we need to do those. We need to keep our files up to date, because what's happening today will be history in years to come. So there is work to do other than just being a docent.
Yes, okay. But I don't know, being a docent, that sounds pretty cool to me. I don't even know what it means, but it sounds pretty cool. You were telling me earlier that the archives is downstairs, you mentioned that, and then you have kind of a special research section for genealogy.
We have a research library. We have a unique collection of family histories. The people who have done a lot of research on families in this area have given us their research materials, which is notebooks and files, and we just have a bookcase full of it. So if you have a particular family that you want to research, we've got there. We've got a lot of census data, and we have anything a genealogist needs to do their work for families in this area. One thing which we're not often able to help people with, people come here wanting to research their Cherokee heritage, and they didn't have a written history. Mm-hmm. So we will send them to the Cherokee Nation up in Cherokee, North Carolina, to be able to get something. But most of the records we have here will start when the county was created in 1819.
Right. So one of the things I often talk about with folks are things for children to do. So would you consider the museum to be a kid-friendly place?
We've not often had children here, but we hope to now. And in the past, when we didn't have many artifacts, children got bored. But I think they would be fascinated by our railway display. So we plan to solicit teachers bringing their classes in. Let us tell them about the history of the county.
There we go. So either our public schools or two private schools, great place to come. And to your point, with Raven Gap Nakuchi, there was a part of sort of the railroad history that they were at one point sort of the custodians of a lot of that. So so I always challenge people that say there aren't things for children to do in Raven County, because I hear that from time to time, to conspicuously point out one of those opportunities. And being here in the museum today, I can tell you there's a lot of cool stuff, like the still display that we're standing behind, and certainly the railroad display. Can't touch it, right? It's very fragile and valuable, obviously, but a lot of neat things for kids to do as well. Cool. If people have some really interesting materials or potentially documents, can certainly contact the Historical Society, and you'll triage it, if you will, to see what's out there.
We can't accept everything because we don't have the storage, we don't have space for it, but we would love to have interesting photographs of the way things were, and we would like to have artifacts that, again, would illustrate what life was like in Rabun County over the last couple of 100 years.
Absolutely. And last but not least, this is the most difficult question of the day, Linda. So if you need a minute, you need to phone a friend. But for folks that don't know where the Museum and Historical Society is located, can you tell us where you are?
We're at 81 North Church Street in Clayton. We're next door to the courthouse.
I was going to say, if you're standing at the courthouse, you just look east towards Main Street and you're looking at the back of the building. But a very, very pretty building. You got plenty of parking nearby, because you can park right here in front of the Historical Society, or you can park in the municipal lot, you know, right behind it. So, and you're walking distance to Main Street.
That's correct. Great places to have lunch over there.
There are a few. I've heard about that. We might have a couple of features on that. So, well, Linda, thank you very much for taking the time to do the virtual tour this morning and talk to us a little bit about the Historical Society. And we'll see you next time, Rabun County.
Bye.